Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our look at chapter 1, which is an introduction into human anatomy and physiology, but it's also an introduction into a larger term and concept that we're going to be getting into, which is called homeostasis. And so what we've looked at so far is leading up to this big idea for chapter 1. At the end of the last video, I left you with this idea of form and function. That when we study anatomy and physiology, it's not enough to just know the form or the anatomy, and it's not just enough to be able to know the physiology or the function of the structure or the organ that we are looking at. You need to understand both in order to understand how and why it's doing what it's doing, and that this understanding happens at the cellular and molecular and chemical level. So it's not happening on the gross level, on the macroscopic level. It's happening down within that microscopic level. And what we need to make sure that we are recognizing is that what is linking the crossroads between form and function, what joins the anatomy with the physiology, the commonality between the two, is this idea of homeostasis. All right, now, homeostasis is going to become a hallmark or a theme throughout all of A&P1, as well as throughout A&P2. All right, and so homeostasis here becomes critical in our understanding of what is happening within the body. And by definition, homeostasis is this process by which the body works to keep the internal environment within a normal range. So everything within the body, every process within the body has a normal range of acceptability. And that normal range of acceptability is what we define as homeostasis. So what are some examples of homeostasis? Well, for example, the pH of blood. All right, we say that the normal pH of blood is 7.4, but in actuality, the homeostasis of blood, pH of blood, is 7.35 to 7.45. So there's a range of normalcy. It's not just 7.4. Our bodies do not work in fixed points. Our body and all of the processes work within a range. All right. Blood pressure. All right, we're so used to hearing that 120 over 80 is normal blood pressure. Well, that's not entirely true. Anything below 120, so usually we say 110 over 60, to about 135 over 90 is considered to be normal. That's a range. But what do? We say 120 over 80 is normal. Well, it's because our brains work in fixed points. All right. Blood glucose levels. All right. We say that 100 is normal for blood glucose levels. Blood glucose. All right. We say 100 is normal, but really anything between 60 and about 130 is viewed as normal. So everything within the body works within a range, and that range is what we define as homeostasis. As long as your pH of blood is between 7.35 and 7.45, you won't die. All right? As long as your blood pressure is between 110 over 60 and 135 over 90, you won't die. All right? As long as blood glucose levels is between 60 and 130, you won't die. All right? And here's the freaky thing. You are always 1 second away from death. You are not guaranteed to be alive in the next second. I was not guaranteed to be alive to finish that last sentence that I said. The only reason that I was able to finish the last 2 sentences was because my body was able to maintain homeostasis. My systems, my processes were kept within a normal range, and my body was able to function. And because my body was able to function within a homeostatic balance, I was allowed to finish the last 5 sentences. But am I guaranteed to finish the next sentence? Not as long, or I am as long as my body's in homeostasis. But as soon as I leave homeostasis, I am no longer guaranteed to be able to live. I could die. Like that. Snap of a finger. I could be gone. If my blood pressure skyrockets to 220 over 160, I could die. If my pH of my blood drops to 7.3, that's acidosis. I could slip into a coma and die. If my body temperature drops below 96 degrees Fahrenheit, I could go into hypothermia and die. As soon as you leave this idea of homeostasis, you are prone to death. And when we think about how many times you are close to dying because your body is trying to work to maintain homeostasis, it's amazing that you've lived to listen to this lecture. That is how fragile the balance of homeostasis can be. Because anything could go wrong in a split second to cause your body to lose homeostasis. And in some cases, prolonged homeostasis does occur. And when prolonged homeostasis occurs, then we have pathology. We have a disease, and I apologize for writing over that, but you'll deal with it. It's okay. We look at this idea of disease. You ever look at that word disease? It's really 2 words. Dis-ease. Dis-ease. Not at ease. Not normal. Disease in its Greek word means not normal. It's a loss of homeostasis. When you're a diabetic, it's a loss of blood glucose homeostasis. When you've got hypertension, it's a loss of blood pressure regulation and homeostasis. When you enter into acidosis or alkalosis, blood is too acidic or the blood is too basic. It's a loss of homeostasis. There's so many examples of how your body can lose homeostasis. Again, it's amazing that you've lived long enough to be able to enjoy this lecture. And when we talk about your heart being able to function normally, when we talk about blood vessels being able to function normally, when we talk about your pancreas being able to function normally, when we talk about your skeletal muscles to be able to function normally, when we talk about the ability for your lungs to function normally, or your brain, or your bone, or your spleen, or your stomach, or your duodenum, or your ileum, or your jejunum, or your ascending colon, or your diaphragm, when we talk about these organs being able to function normally, we have to understand the physiology that has taken place. The process of regulating that physiology is homeostasis. And that is what is taking place at the cellular and the molecular and the chemical layers. And it's these processes that are taking place within the tissues that work together to form the organs, that work together to form the organ systems, that work together to create you as an individual, as an organism. The tissues making up the organs, making up the organ systems, making up the organism will not function. They will cease to exist if the cells and the molecules and the chemical processes happening within those tissues are not in homeostasis. And so it really is at this cellular level, and how the cells interact with the other cells that are surrounding it, that allows you to maintain homeostasis, and that guarantees your existence into the next second. What does this process look like? Well, there's three main steps. There's really 5, maybe 6 steps in this process of maintaining homeostasis, but there's 3 key functions, if you would, or steps, and then there's some sub-steps in there. So the 3 major mechanisms that are helping to regulate homeostasis are you've got receptors, you've got a control center, and you've got effectors. All right. Well, if we look at this, hold on one second. If we look at this, when homeostasis is achieved, it's what we call the set point. Right? It's called the set point. All right. So everything is good. We're in homeostasis. We're within the normal range, which is what we define as a set point. All right. So this is really number 1. All right. Number 2, some stimulus happens. All right. Change in temperature, that's a stimulus. Someone touches you, that's a stimulus. You go to Olive Garden and you have the never-ending pasta and the never-ending breadsticks and the never-ending salad and the never-ending soup. Your blood glucose levels go through the roof. That's a stimulus. You're watching a horror movie. That's a stimulus. Increases your blood pressure. Right? You go running. You're lifting weights. You're doing Pilates. That's a stimulus. You hold your breath. Carbon dioxide is being held. Decreases the pH within your blood. That's a stimulus. Any number of stimuli. Right? But that stimulus is going to be perceived by a receptor. Right? Now those receptors can be baroreceptors. They detect pressure. They can be chemoreceptors. Okay. Monitors chemical changes. All right. They can be touch receptors. All right. They can be hormone receptors that are responding to hormones. They can be neuroreceptors, which are responding to action potentials. Right. And there's subdivisions under here. You have muscarinic and nicotinic receptors, for examples, under hormone receptors. Chemoreceptors, you can have pH receptors. Right? You can have calcium receptors. You can have sodium receptors. Right? You've got differing receptors that are under each of these big classifications of receptors. So very quickly you start to have hundreds of different types of receptors that are monitoring for stimuli. These receptors take that information from the stimulus, and so our receptors here are number 3, and they send that information to the control center, and that control center is typically within the central nervous system. Right? Maybe it's sending it to the thalamus, maybe it's sending it to the cerebellum, or to the cerebrum, or to the hypothalamus. Right? Maybe it's a reflex arc that's going to the spinal cord. Right? It's going to some control center. And that control center is going to sit there and say, well, here's the set point. This is what is normal. Dang it, here's this new information that tells me that set point is now no longer there. I'm either way too high or I'm way too low. Right? I'm either too far to the left or too far to the right of my set point. Either way, I need to get myself back to the center. I need to get myself back to that normal range. Right? And how do I do that? Well, I do that through effectors. Effectors are going to carry out a response to change the direction of the stimulus. It's going to bring the body back into a normal alignment. And so effectors cause a response. And that response should bring you back to the set point. Should bring you back to the set point. Right? So this is a 6-step process of how we maintain homeostasis. Right? It's a 6-point process in how we maintain homeostasis. Right? So you've got your stimulus. It's either an external change or an internal change. All right? Which is going to cause an internal response. All right? This is, hold on one second. This is your stimulus. These are your receptors. And those receptors are going to the control center. And the control center is going to the effectors, which are going to attempt to compensate for whatever the loss of control is. Right? And the response will hopefully be to return the body back to homeostasis. Or it will persist and eventually be considered a disease. A loss of control. When we deal with pathology, when we deal with a pathological issue, we're dealing with a disease. Dis-ease. Not at ease. Back in the 80s, back when I was growing up, right, back in the day, right, it was common, it was cool, it was the in thing. Right? You'd be with your friends and you start going ahead and you start dogging on one another and you start going ahead and you start, slamming insults, and this is where your mama's so fat type of jokes came in and that kind of stuff, and you'd be hanging with your friends and all of a sudden, oh man, you got dissed. You've been dissed. What does that mean? I've been dissed? Means I wasn't. Means I'm not a part of. Means I'm less than. Means I'm not cool with. I was dissed. I was disrespected. I was put down. I was excluded from the group. When we were dissed, means we weren't. We were not. So that prefix dis means not with or not within. What are we not within? We are not within the range of ease. When you are riding on easy street, you are in homeostasis. And that's important. Right? That is important. Now, a lot of this stuff here is really going to be a little bit of a review of what you're dealing with in the lab material, but this is kind of the overall organization of the body. All right? So we've talked about this a little bit. All right? We know that at the macro level or the gross level, we have the organism. Right? And this organism is made up of organ systems, and these organ systems work together to do what? To make up the organism. And then the organ systems we know are made up of organs. And so organs are a group of structures that work together to perform a common task. Right? So all of the organs that are within the cardiovascular system are working to move blood. Right? All the organs of the digestive system are working to break down and absorb nutrients and remove waste, so on and so forth. Well, organs are made up of tissues, and we're going to find out that there's actually there are four main types of tissues. There's epithelial tissue, there's connective tissue, there's muscular tissue, and there's nervous tissue. Right? And all organs are made up of two or more different types of tissues. Right? So when you look at a kidney, you're not just looking, the tissue is not a kidney, that's the organ. But the kidney is going to be made up of epithelial tissue. It's going to be made up of connective tissue. It's going to be made up of nervous tissue. Not really muscular tissue, but it's going to be made up of nervous, connective, and epithelial tissue. Right? And those tissues are made up of cells. And so the types of cells that we have that make up epithelial tissue are squamous cells, cuboidal cells, columnar cells, and transitional cells. The types of tissues that make up connective tissues, the type of cells that make up connective tissues are going to be things like adipose tissue, bone, chondrocytes, or cells that make up cartilage, red blood cells that help to make up blood, dense reticular cells, what we call reticulocytes. And these are things that can make up different types of connective tissue. So all of our tissues are made up of different cells. And as we will learn, all of our cells are made up of organelles. Mitochondria, the nucleus, lysozymes, Golgi bodies, rough endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, the cell membrane, so on and so forth. And all of these organelles are going to be made up of chemical components, molecules and atoms. And guess what? In chapter 2, of our look. Chapter 2 is dealing with chemistry. Chapter 3 is dealing with the organelles. Chapter 4 is dealing with tissues and the cells that make them up. Chapters 5 through 20 are dealing with the organs and the organ systems. And so our own studying of the human body is going to follow this level of organization. We're going to spend 3 weeks on Chapter 2. We're going to spend 2 weeks on Chapter 3. And then we're going to start moving through the integumentary system. We're going to start moving through the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. And that's where we end with AMP1. So this level of organization is important for us to recognize and to understand. These next few slides here just kind of introduce you to what the organ systems are. You will notice that there are actually 12 different organ systems. We have the integumentary system, count them out with me, 1. We have the skeletal system, 2. We have the muscular system, 3. We have the nervous system, 4. We have the endocrine system, 5. We have the cardiovascular system, 6. We have the lymphatic and the immune system, 7. We have the respiratory system, 8. We have the digestive system, 9. We have the urinary system, 10. We have the male reproductive system, 11. And we have the female reproductive system, 12. Right? There are 12 systems. You cannot just say reproductive system. Because the last time I checked, the female does not have a penis and the male does not have an ovary. They are 2 separate reproductive systems. Anatomically and physiologically, they are different. Without an argument. Okay? Now, we count 12 systems, but some people take the lymphatic system and the immune system and split them up. Right? Some people consider the fluid that surrounds all of our tissues and cells, what we call the interstitial fluid, to be another organ system, a 14th organ system called the interstitium. And we'll talk more about why that is. Right? There's actually inflammatory response that happens within the interstitium. There's actually warning signs to disease. There's physiological changes within the interstitium that are warning signs for the onset of disease. Some people consider the interstitium to be an organ system. But for our general understanding of the body, there's 12 systems. And then the last thing I kind of want to leave you with, and then we're going to wrap this up here in a few seconds, are the characteristics of life. And so what does it mean to be alive? Well, all living things have to be organized, and humans are no different. We looked at that. Atoms, molecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and an organism. Right? All living things are organized like that, though. All living things have to have at least one cell. Right? If you're going to be considered alive, you have to be made up of one cell. Right? Humans are no different. Right? Humans have, on average, about 10 trillion to 16 trillion cells that make us up. Right? That meets the cell category. Right? Metabolism. Right? All organisms have to be able to conduct chemical reactions. Right? Both anabolic and catabolic reactions. Things that make and things that break down chemical compounds. We're going to talk more about that in Chapter 2. Right? All living things must react to their environment. That's the stimulus. And what reacts to a stimulus? A receptor. Right? So all things have to be able to react Why? To maintain homeostasis. All living things must be able to maintain their own internal environment. All things must be able to develop and grow. Even one-celled organisms grow, they get bigger. All living things must be able to reproduce, and reproduce on their own. And like it or not, you can deny it all you want, but all living things must evolve. Evolution is real, it's not a made-up principle, and all living things do evolve as a species. That is different than reacting to one's environment. That is different. All living things must evolve. And not all living things, or not all things, fit these categories. In other words, we've got things like viruses. Viruses are not living. Viruses are not living. Right? We have things like prions, which are proteins. All right? They're not living. All right? Viruses are not living. Viruses are basically nucleic acids covered by protein. Right? And nucleic acids are things like DNA and RNA. Right? So things that you might consider, COVID-19 is not living. And it's kicking our asses. But it's not alive. We're being terrorized, decimated, beaten up by something that's not even alive. Keep that in mind. So this is where we're going to stop with this segment, kind of give you time to go through and digest, answer the questions, reflect on some things, maybe jot down some questions. All right? And remember, you can save those questions for our Q&A sessions, or you can always jot me an email, right, and ask me those questions. I'm always happy to answer and entertain any thoughts or puzzlements that you may have. And until we come together again for the next session, I'll catch you on the flip side.